So one hypothesis that was put forth by Nagels in 2002 to explain how language development in autistic children works is something called the form is easy, meaning is hard hypothesis. And the form in this case is referring to language form, language structure, and meaning is what it sounds like, what that structure means conceptually. And so to the extent that the discovery and abstraction of grammatical forms, of syntactic forms, of morphological forms can occur prior to complete establishment of their meanings, which is actually how syntactic bootstrapping works. You have the linguistic form before you really understand what the full meaning of that word is, but the form gives you some clues. Then children with ASD, with autism spectrum disorder, should not demonstrate as severe delays of syntactic or morphological development as they do of the things that really relate to meaning, so semantics and pragmatics, meaning in context. And so let's look at the sort of our current knowledge about how that works. And so for lexical development in ASD children, it seems like there's maybe sometimes a delay in the beginning of the onset of lexical development. But they do have a lot of similarities to typically developing children. So there's similar lexical diversity, how many different word forms that they learn. They tend to have a noun bias, a higher percentage of nouns than verbs in their early vocabulary, so that aligns with typically developing children. And actually, something which you may not have realized is that toddlers who have ASD can follow a speaker's focus of attention to learn new object labels. So despite having some kind of social cue impairment, they have some sensitivity to the kind of social cues that allow you to learn new object labels. But there are some notable differences. So, for example, when we look at the vocabularies of ASD kids, there's a lack of mental state terms, things that refer to the mental states of other people, like think, know, imagine, and wonder. These kinds of mental state words are underrepresented, as well as words that refer to emotions, again, an internal state, right? And ASD kids have difficulty, in fact, labeling emotions in video vignettes. So there's a lack of understanding of what that corresponds to. And ASD children who are low verbal, they don't have much lexical production or general language production. They tend to use more general all-purpose verbs, right? Things that combine together that get you a lot of bang for your buck, so make and do and go. Combined together with lots of words to give you lots of expressive power. And they use these a lot more than typically developing children and high verbal ASD kids, which makes sense. Like if you're not saying a lot, you want to sort of use more general all-purpose verbs to get your point across because you're more likely to be able to do so. But you know, what's going on here? And what Nagel said is that all of these effects can be traced to difficulties in socially based meaning discernment. So children who find it difficult to read the mental states and emotions of others will likewise find it difficult to learn the words that refer to these. Right? If they can't actually get the concept, they don't understand the concept, irrespective of the linguistic label, then it's not surprising that they then have trouble attaching the appropriate linguistic label. And lower functioning kids who experience even greater difficulties in navigating the cognitive and social worlds basically over-rely on words that are basically bleached of specific lexical content. So make and go are super general, right? You can use them in combination with lots of different things. And so those are sort of, again, all-purpose words, right? They're sort of like your general tool that you can use to open anything or express anything you might want to express. And so going back to some other sort of notable differences is that ASD kids don't seem to have something that typically developing kids do, which is a shape bias. That is, when they get a new term, if they say, for example, that kitty on top is a kitty, then typically developing kids will say, oh, well then things that have the same shape are probably also kitties. This is something that is present in early word learning. And ASD kids don't seem to have this. It's not obvious to them that you should extend on the basis of shape. And in general, they also have trouble sort of creating these more abstract categories, like kitty refers to all things that have the properties that we as adults would associate with cats. That's a category, the cat category. And ASD kids have trouble building these kinds of abstract representations, right? They maybe are more sensitive to more details than they should be, which impairs their categorical induction. If we look at morphology, however, now this starts getting into language form, right? So for morphology, the order of acquisition for the morphological affixes, at least in English, appears pretty similar. There don't seem to be any real noticeable differences there, and the development of the morphological rule knowledge also seems similar, where you appropriately add plural markers to novel nouns. So if I have one wug, I have two wugs, that S plural marker. The past tense marker to novel verbs, so I wugged today, I wugged yesterday. ASD kids get this just fine, recognizing that ing signals an ongoing, continuing event. Running, the running is still happening, which is imperfective aspect, while the ed signals the perfective. So I today, I kicked the bucket yesterday. That event of bucket kicking has completed. That's perfective aspect. All of this is something that these ASD kids can get, right? Like the morphology is okay, right? And then when we look at syntax, there seems to be, a remarkable amount of similarity to typically developing kids. So for example, preschoolers with ASD understand WH questions, that is questions in English that begin with WH words like who or what or where, right? Which is something that is very important in terms of being able to find out about your world, right? Asking WH questions. Preschoolers with ASD understand WH questions just fine. They seem to process sentences in a similar way to typically developing children. You take each word as it comes in and you build a representation of that entire sentence. You're processing your sentences incrementally. And high-functioning ASD children understand fairly, complex structural restrictions on, for example, reflexive pronouns like himself or herself. So when you say Jack washed himself, that can only mean that Jack washed Jack. But if you say Jack washed him, then Jack has to wash some other male person, right? So this restriction on what reflexive pronouns can refer to is something that also ASD children seem to get without a problem, this kind of structural rule, right? So returning again to the form is easy, meaning is hard hypothesis, the idea is that there are disconnects between the form, the structure, the syntax and morphology of language and the meaning, right? So these concepts that are associated with them. So this disconnect is intriguing because the directionality suggests that at least some components of grammatical, that is syntactic or morphological form, can develop more quickly than and possibly independently of some components of lexical, meaning of utterance level, meaning of the semantics and the pragmatics. So that's the hypothesis for form is easy, meaning is hard when it comes to autistic children's development. The form, the structure seems easier to understand. It's there in the linguistic signal. The meaning for some of these things is hard because these are conceptual things, emotions or mental states, social information that seems harder for these children to notice.